o'clock, and this is the second hour of Power Talk. We're asking in this segment whether the public protector appointment process was mismanaged or not. So we also last week the ad hoc committee responsible for this appointment completing what was undoubtedly a marathon interview process. 14 candidates starting early on Thursday morning. They worked throughout the night. 20 hours later, it was complete. But there was a lot of criticism. Some of the MPs described the process, the length of time as unfair. The DA slammed the process for the high-profile post as being mismanaged and unfair. They were jammed into a single day. Corruption Watch, by the way, also expressed its concerns about the long day, saying that it was taxing on both committee members and on the candidates. But here are some of the biggest concerns with the process. That apparently a lot of the work that had been done on the day and a lot of the discoveries that were being made could have been rooted out in a pre-screening process. Now, someone who knows a lot about this is Leon Ayo, who's the managing director at Odgers Berndtson South Africa. And Leon, by the way, has had some experience and was involved with the appointment of the UK's public protectors. So, Leon Ayo, joining us from Cape Town. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it, and welcome to Power Talk.
Pleasure. Good morning, Iman.
Okay, so you had a look at the process, and something stood out for you. What for you were ways in which this might have been mismanaged, or and do you concur with some of the observations made by political parties and bodies like Corruption Watch?
Well, I do. I agree with much of the criticism of this process, and I think you talked about it being a marathon process, and an extension that you're almost turning a very important appointment into a reality TV session, which it really shouldn't be.
Well, just on the reality TV thing, I mean, the one observation I saw from a lot of our Twitter users was we wish that we could have this level of transparency in the appointment of other positions of leadership, like the president, for example.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, certainly I'm not suggesting there's any corruption at all, just huge inefficiency and actually very unfair on the panel and very unfair on the candidates that were being interviewed last. To stay focused for 20 hours, to have the same level of scrutiny is impossible. So at Odgers Berndtson Sub-Saharan Africa, we do senior appointments across the continent for chief execs, chief financial officers, chairman, and my firm internationally has been responsible for some of the most important public sector appointments, such as chief executive of the National Health Service in England, governor of the Bank of England. And getting these processes right in the public sector is arguably more important than getting it right in the private sector. And executive search processes really mitigate against risk and inefficiencies. So, for example, I believe advertising no longer works. If you're relying on an advert, you're only going to get the candidates that have seen that advert and decided to apply. By all means advertise, but this has to be in conjunction with executive search, whereby you have a firm such as mine reaching out to identify the best possible candidates in the market for that role. And to do that, you need to talk to lots of players in the market. And quite often, you're going to be going global, or it might just be a local search. But it's important that you've spoken to all the best possible candidates. That means you've got the best possible long list.
Well, let's just go before you move on to step two. In the search, and this would have been, I think, the most public announcement in South Africa. Everybody knew she was leaving office. This is Advocate Thuli Madonsela, and that we're now starting the search for a new candidate and a replacement for her office. So, what do you make of how the nominations were done then?
No, again, I think there's opportunities to improve this, if I'm being polite and slightly politically correct. I think we have to ensure we reach
just shoot from the hip, Leon. Go for it.
I'll tell it like it is. I'll tell it like it is. With any appointment, you want to make sure you get the best candidates. And quite often, the best candidates might not be interested for a number of reasons. Therefore, a credible third-party independent advisor can encourage the best candidates to apply. And behind closed doors, we can speak very freely about what the realities of the challenge are, what the political landscape is, and what the deliverables are going to be. I think where this process fell down beyond that was around the lack of pre-screening. So when you engage with a search firm, by the time you interview the individuals, you know full well that they are motivated for the role, they are qualified, what the market perception is. We've also got rid of any skeletons in the closet. So from background checks, criminal checks, qualification checks, reputational checks, you know that the people that you ultimately interview can all do the job. They all want to do the job. And the final stage is going to be a matter of that chemistry around who is the best candidate at that time. And then again, I criticised the final stage of the process pretty harshly in terms of 1 hour for such an important appointment is not sufficient to make a judgment, let alone if the panel have been interviewing for 20 hours, like you say, it's a marathon session. What we do is construct, by all means, a 1 hour interview initially, but in addition to that, there should be business simulation assessments that test the skills required in a robust fashion so that we know these candidates can deliver. And quite often those assessments can take 5 or 6 hours.
Wow.
And part of the process is not just doing an off-the-shelf psychometric, it's designing something that is specific to the needs of that role. And this is such a hugely important role. 1 hour in the early hours of the morning just isn't going to be sufficient. And if we think about all the money that's been wasted flying people in that actually don't meet the pre-screening qualifications, you could have saved a lot of money and a lot of embarrassment by having a robust process.
So you talk about simulation, which I think is interesting because, you want to see how they would respond, to a live situation or a case or something that's brought across their table. So you would have put these 14 candidates through some kind of a simulation process then?
What I would have done actually is before we'd have even done that, I would have got it down to 3 candidates with a maximum of 5. So firstly, in terms of mapping the market, there might be 100 people that are qualified to do this job. We'd speak to all of them, we'd assess motivations, then we'd do market soundings to make sure these people were sufficiently respected to be put forward. We would put forward 3 or 5 that we believed were the most committed, the most motivated, and the best qualified. And then we design a specific assessment to judge them in that role. And I think that assessment can be, there are certain leadership skills that are generic, that are important for every role. There are certain skills such as media management, robustness, resilience, that you can test for. And I think that's really important.
I think the way in which, and one of the tools that the current public protector perhaps employed to her advantage was how she managed the media. And I think that was responsible in, making the office in many ways what it was. And it's interesting to me that you add this as part of your criteria as well, that, someone has to also be able to have that kind of media fit and understands how to conduct themselves when interacting with the media, because otherwise the work is largely, it's largely anonymous. It is up to the person in the position to let us know how the money is being spent, what cases are being pursued, how that pursuit is happening, and what the success levels are. Maybe then look with me across the 14 candidates who, as you say, those who came in at the latter end of the process, or at the tail end of the process rather, were disadvantaged, because I think the last interview happened at 1:45 a.m. in the morning. Who kind of fit the bill in many ways better than others?
Sure. I mean, without commenting on the specifics of the candidates, that's not my role here. But what I will say, I completely agree with you in terms of, I interview leaders across government, across the private sector, internationally, most days. And if you're interviewing more than 4 people, it's a hugely exhausting process. You've got somebody where really you'll spend at least an hour and a half with them that is sharing their soul, their background, their journey, their motivations and aspirations for their willingness to take on the role. And to do that 14 times, I deem it nearly impossible to stay and have the same level of focus. So by the time you probably get to the 6th candidate, you're probably thinking about what you're going to have for dinner, are you going to go back to your hotel on time? And it's just completely normal human behavior to start switching off. And I think you shouldn't underestimate, when somebody's putting themselves forward for a role, and particularly under this level of public scrutiny, it's a massive life event for them. So to squeeze it into 1 hour and then to have it, in the early hour of the morning is just, I consider it to be unacceptable.
So would you say that this process, by and large, in this particular format, has been a disservice to the candidates in general, and specifically to those who came perhaps just past the halfway mark?
Definitely. I think if we look at Thuli Madonsela, she's been a bastion of integrity for South Africa for a period of time and been a real role model internationally. And it's almost been a disservice to the office. And I don't think it's a deliberate, anything to do with corruption. I just think it's been quite naive in terms of approaching how to conduct an appointment. Getting the right leaders in the right positions is critical element in in an organisation being successful or a country being successful, as we've seen not just locally but internationally. So to reduce it to a 1-hour interview without pre-screening, it really is a disservice. And I think that's why we take our role very seriously. Getting the right leader in the right role will mean an organisation will be successful. So you need to do it with great consideration, great planning, and robust assessments.
You know, the Office of the Public Protector and the power of the work was, I think there was no better encapsulation of it in the recent Nkandla judgment and in what Chief Justice Mogoeng had to say. That the office would be the embodiment of a biblical David. The public, fights the most powerful and very well-resourced Goliath. Impropriety and corruption by government officials. In other words, that's what impropriety and the actions of government officials are tantamount to. The Public Protector is one of the true crusaders and champions of anti-corruption and clean governance. And if, as you say, this office, we're looking for a candidate to fill that seat and they haven't been given the right context to show their best side or to put their best foot forward, how do we know we're going to end up with the best of the best then?
Well, I'd say from this process we don't. But what I would say is actually, it's never too late. Quite often conducting these processes, it might be on the second or third iteration that we get to the right candidate. And my view is very much time. Winston Churchill used to say, time spent in reconnaissance is seldom wasted. It's worth mapping the market. It's worth doing a deep dive into the candidate's motivations and abilities. It's better to find out they're not suitable now than in 6 months down the line. As you've mentioned, it's such a critical appointment for the country, particularly given the current state of affairs, both politically, democratically, and economically. So not only is this role in Thuli Madonsela a symbol of what is good in the Constitution, it's a way of stabilizing the markets and keeping the rand strong and avoiding a downgrade as well. So I think it's so important that actually this should not be rushed. It should be very considered, and the candidates should have the opportunity to present themselves in the best light, not in the early hours of the morning.
All right, let's take your thoughts on 0861 987 000. I'm talking to Leon Ayo, who's the Chief Executive at Odgers Berndtson South Africa, involved, as you heard Leon say, in the appointments of many high-profile positions, the Governor of the Bank of England among them, and the UK's version of our Public Protector here in South Africa. Thabo, you're in Lyndhurst. Good morning.
Hi, man. How are you? And your guest.
Welcome. Good, thanks.
I got two comments. The first is that how do you sit in a committee, come to a conclusion that we're going to do it in one day, and then the next day you're going to go in media and criticize that we've been sitting for long hours? I mean, really, it is a committee that decided as a collective to do the process in one day. And next thing they're going to go back and criticize a decision which they were part of. Do you understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Which really is devious. If you ask me, it's devious, and it says a lot about you as a person, if you know what I mean. And secondly, I think we are a new country. We are really a new country as compared to the UK. Just to talk to the guests. So we are a learning country, and we do appreciate such criticisms. However, we just need to note that down, that we are a new country and we are learning. And probably with the next appointment of a public protector in 7 years' time, we'll be able to correct what we didn't do right.
Yeah.
But we are a learning country. But in regards to the MPs criticizing a decision that they were part of, it's really devious, and it shows the kind of people that they are.
All right. Thabo in Lyndhurst taking aim at the MPs who criticized the process, but saying we are learning and perhaps we get it, we do it better next time. Fighting Moketa on Twitter says not only was the 1 hour too little for such a big role, the committee omitted doing research on some candidates, and that is so sad. Ben Mataile on Twitter, time of the interview process. How can they interview candidates the whole day? It should have been a 2-day process. Leon?
No, I agree with the guys on Twitter, and to Tarbo's comment, I would agree in terms of, yes, a young democracy, and by all means, we can learn and move forward. And I've got an English accent, but I'm very much invested in this country, and I love it here and want to stay. But yeah, we should learn from the mistakes of more mature democracies. It took them 400 years to get it right. And if we look at America with Donald Trump and Brexit in the UK, it's far from perfect. So let's look at the best of other democracies, but equally we can fast-track our lessons here in South Africa so it doesn't take as long to get to where we want to be.
Let's go to MJ in Kempton Park. Good morning.
Morning, Iman. How are you?
Good, and you?
Good. I have a problem with people who always come out and want to act as if they are holy. The chairperson of that ad hoc committee spoke that they all agreed that in order not to prejudice anybody, in order to be fair to everybody, they will interview all of them at once, because it was members of the committee that raised that if we interview this one today, this one tomorrow, the other one might see what the other one was asked, then they might be able to be unfair. So I have a problem with these ones of DA coming out and saying this was unfair, but they agreed. Why must they say it was unfair? And also, these things, they are always political. So even Corruption Watch, the first statement I heard from them, they had said, no, they are happy with this process. Now they are having a problem with it. I don't understand. Is it just being political or what?
All right, MJ in Kempton Park, appreciate that. It is an interesting and crucial point, Leon, because the whole other reason that people were subjected to a singular process at a singular time was to not give anyone an unfair advantage, having listened to other people's submissions or responses on what would have been thorny and critical questions. I'm thinking of, when, for example, in the US, you have to have a jury locked away so that they aren't, that they can have time to deliberate, or they are not exposed to media reports and things like that might influence or prejudice their verdicts in certain cases. Whether that might be something in a context like this we could consider next time round. How do we mitigate this unfair advantage for other candidates that are still to be heard?
I think the unfair advantage question is actually, it's probably quite an innocent mistake that's been made, and I think we expect an awful lot from our politicians, and none of us are experts in every domain. If you want legal advice, you'll see a lawyer. If you want financial advice, you'll see a financial advisor. And I think when it comes to making appointments, they've clearly not had the best advice. So in terms of being fair and transparent, they could have staged it over 2-3 days. It would have arguably been more expensive, but actually mitigated against the risks of falling asleep during the 20-hour marathon session. Yeah. But as I said, it could have taken one day if the pre-screening had been done, if they qualified the candidates ahead, because not all of them arguably should have been interviewed in that face-to-face public manner. Perhaps when the screening had been done, the assessments had been done, and we had the 2 or 3 appointable candidates, at that stage we could have gone public and done that process. And it is unusual to scrutinise candidates in public, but I believe that was done for reasons of transparency. So I think we can be very harsh on politicians, and we should be, as a discerning democracy, but I think they've just been taken bad advice, and actually the process could have helped them if it was managed more effectively.
Okay, so all right, if we had to do this next time round, and you had one of our callers say we're a growing democracy and this is the first time we've had this happen in quite this way, the pre-screening process, you say, could have rooted out a lot of little niggly hiccups along the way. We could have saved ourselves the covering costs of accommodation, flights and food and all of those things. You spoke very early on about, not using off-the-shelf psychometric processes and things like that. If you had to put together the ideal selection, screening, and I don't want to use the word interrogating process, but interviewing process, how would that all come together in a compact that serves our needs in filling an office as important as this one?
No, it's a great question, and I'd love to have the opportunity to put that together. And I think, when we design assessments for, be they chief execs in parts of Africa or indeed public sector organisations around the world, we've got to think about what evidence do we need to see to give us comfort that this is the right individual for the job. A lot of that comfort will come from the search process, whereby we're talking to people in the market or the political world to say, who is the best person for this role? So you'll get informal recommendations. We then are really going to be assessing, I think for this role that's so central to our country, we've got to be looking at the person's individual values and motivations. Because it's not about the financial package, this role, it's about the integrity of our democracy and constitution. And I think somebody that will communicate that passionately is going to give us great confidence. And arguably, most of those candidates would do that. But what is key, and what you've touched upon, and what Tuli Madonsela has been great at, is that engagement in dealing with the media and in crisis management. Because if we cannot communicate what we're doing, how do the public know they're being protected? So I think it's really key that we will build in some element of media communication to that assessment. And then from that, we could make a qualified decision.
Okay, so are we to side-eye our candidates currently then?
I don't really want to comment on the current candidates.
Given the process then and the anomalies that you've raised with us.
I would say it's high risk to make an appointment based on the evidence we've seen. So with time spent in some assessment and further screening will be time well spent.
Leon, we appreciate your time and your insights this morning with us. Go well. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman.
Power Business with Andile Khumalo, Monday to Thursdays, 5 to 6 p.m.
We all know how controversial e-tolls were. They became a big issue here in Gauteng. We thought it's a relevant story to at least understand why the exit from some of the investors. Director of Mantemoka Investments, TV Kobane.